Lesson 26, Review. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on Lesson 26, which is on page 75. This particular lesson is a special lesson for several reasons. First of all, it's a review lesson, so much of the material is simply review from previous lessons. For example, in section 216, all those questions there are simply review questions that cover material that we have already covered in past lessons. So I'm not going to go over that stuff again. This class consists of a recorded lecture series, and so that means that you can go back anytime and listen to anything again, as much as you want. So there's no need for me to repeat myself. In fact, I probably repeat myself already too much as it is. So you can review section 216 on your own, 217, and even 218 on page 76. All those questions are exact questions from past lessons, so there's no reason to go over them again. Another reason that this lesson is special is because it contains your first real Latin reading. Okay? Not everything in this lesson is review. Some of this is new material. For example, section 219. 219 talks a bit about Julius Caesar and his career. Then in section 220, we read our first real Latin. And what is section 220? Well, that's the very beginning of Caesar's Gallic Wars. In English, we call it Caesar's Gallic Wars. That's just the title, the conventional title that we use. When you see this work referred to in an academic text, like an article, for example, they often call it DBG as an abbreviation. DBG. That stands for De Bello Gallico, okay, which in Latin means concerning the Gallic War. And then oftentimes you'll see the word commentary along with it. If I remember correctly, I think it says Commentarii De Bello Gallico or something like that. And so in English, sometimes they'll translate that as Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars. And so this literary work, known as Caesar's Gallic Wars, this literary work really is the backbone of this entire textbook. Okay, this textbook that we're using is called The First Year of Latin by Gunnison and Harley. And so their plan throughout the book is to get you acclimated to the things you need to know to be able to read Caesar's Gallic Wars. So it's a very Caesar-centric textbook. Everything is geared toward getting you to read that particular work. Many years ago, when I started this lecture series, I was looking for a certain kind of textbook to use. I had just published my beginner's Latin book, which is called Getting Started with Latin, and people started to purchase the textbook and use it. You know, that textbook is for absolute beginners, kids, people who have never studied a language before. The whole point of it is to give you a very easy introduction to just let you get into the world of Latin. And it uses somewhat of an unorthodox method. It doesn't really teach the language like other textbooks. It teaches it kind of as a one word at a time kind of thing. Many textbooks teach you lots of things all at once. My book, Getting Started with Latin, it just teaches you one thing at a time and lets you focus just on one thing. So people started to use the textbook, and then they would send me emails and say, "Hey, I just finished your Latin book, and it's great. I really enjoyed it. Now what do I do?" Nowadays, my beginning Latin book has a sequel. The sequel is called Keep Going with Latin. That's the purple one. And so that's the sequel. So these days, when someone asks me that question, I can simply say, well, do the sequel. That's Keep Going with Latin. But back in those days, when I first started Lenny's Latin class, that book did not exist. So I tried to make this lecture series as some place to go for self-taught students and homeschoolers so that they could start to advance their knowledge And so as I started looking around for textbooks, I wanted to accomplish two things. I wanted a textbook that was in the public domain so that I could use it as much as I wanted to without violating anyone's copyrights. And also I wanted a book that got them going into some kind of Latin literature while teaching grammar, of course. These days, a lot of Latin teachers teach heavily relying on spoken Latin. That's very much in vogue these days, and I'm very much in favor of that. I strongly believe that speaking Latin will help you. And so in Latin education, there's kind of a divide these days, sort of a watershed or something like that, that divides Latin education into two main methods. One of them is called grammar translation, and the other one falls under the general heading of active Latin, that is, speaking it, using it conversationally, and relying heavily on the speaking part of the learning experience. You might call that method immersion. Also, the term comprehensible input is a big thing, which is part of the spoken Latin methodology. So you have two main methods here. You have grammar translation, and then you have the spoken Latin or the immersion style. The grammar translation method is the traditional way, for the past 100 years or so that people have done this. You dissect the language, you look at the grammar, and then you engage in the act of translating Latin into English. So you have Latin teachers in these two camps. Oftentimes, they don't agree with each other's methods. Oftentimes, the Latin teachers who focus on grammar translation, they're not big fans of the teachers who teach through immersion and through speaking Latin. Maybe they're not used to it. Maybe they don't believe in that kind of methodology. Likewise, sometimes the teachers who rely heavily on spoken Latin, they're not big fans of the grammar translation method. They think there ought to be a lot less focus on grammar. So, as you know, I'm a huge fan of speaking Latin. But nevertheless, I wanted this particular class to be very much grammar translation. Why? Because a lot of the people who will be using this Latin class are people who are at home learning on their own. And for some of them, this may be really the only serious Latin class they ever have access to. And so what I wanted this to do is to mimic the kind of experience you might have in a traditional high school or college Latin grammar class, okay? You can go online these days with your friends and speak Latin. You can have a Zoom chat. You can go on Discord, discussion groups, chat groups, video chats. All these different opportunities exist these days to speak Latin. You can go to spoken Latin workshops, events. So there are lots of chances to speak Latin with people, but there aren't that many recorded classes that are grammar translation. So the goal of Lenny's Latin class is to be a traditional grammar translation Latin class experience, to mimic a real class, with a textbook, with homework, grammatical terms. That way it satisfies more of the academic side of Latin learning. So let's say, for example, you're a homeschooler and you're using this class to learn at home. As you do so, you can get some good knowledge from this class about, grammar and the different classifications of, Latin grammatical constructions, all the different uses of the ablative case. You can learn a lot of grammar that way, which you can then take with you to college, because at the college level, they don't have any interest really in speaking Latin. What you do at the college level is you heavily do grammar translation. To my knowledge, the college programs out there focus heavily on literature. It's a literature-based study of Latin. And so the grammar that you learn gets you to the point where you can read the texts and then analyze the literature. That's what you do at college if you study classics in college or graduate school. There's not a whole lot of linguistics. Not really a whole lot of pedagogy, like training you how to teach. Not a whole lot of focus on material culture, like archaeology, art history, or other related areas like epigraphy, inscriptions. In the field of classics, there are lots of related fields. If you study it in college, you're going to basically be doing grammar translation study of literature, okay? So the goal of this class is to provide that service, to fit that particular need for someone who wants to do that, to do a literary, grammar translation-based study, an academic study of the language. Now, that having been said, speaking the language can really help you. It can help you to learn more vocabulary, to get accustomed to the different forms, and it just will make the Latin language more natural for you. I've heard many people say, after they come to a spoken Latin workshop for the first time, I've heard this a million times, after their first spoken Latin workshop and they've had their first experience trying to carry on a conversation in Latin, they come back later and they say, I feel like I never really knew Latin until I started speaking it. I've heard that statement a million times from people, and that's how I felt too. For me, personally, speaking Latin, I really credit that with a lot of what I know and a lot of the familiarity I have with the language. So I encourage you wholeheartedly to speak Latin to help you familiarize yourself with this language. When you speak a language that's, viewed as a foreign language, it makes that foreign language not quite so foreign anymore. When you speak it long enough, it ceases to be foreign and it starts to be a language that you speak. And that makes a big difference in the way you approach it. And honestly, it makes it easier to read texts. So grammar translation is valuable. Speaking Latin is valuable. They're both valuable. But the purpose of this class, Lenny's Latin class, is to do the grammar translation thing. Along with that, I encourage you to speak it as much as you can as part of this class, but that's not really what the class is geared toward. Another thing for those of you who are self-taught, or perhaps homeschoolers, is that sometimes it can be tough to learn grammar in your native language. I've often thought that we don't really think about grammar so much in our native language. In fact, we don't think about our native language at all. We just kind of say things in our native language. And we say things based on how they feel to us. If you want to be an educated person, it helps to know grammar because that's language. That's how we communicate. That's how we transfer information to each other. Being able to read and comprehend and being able to write well and write clearly. These are good language skills that really anybody needs. And so learning some knowledge about grammar can really help you with that. I'll never forget my senior year of high school. I was sitting in a high school Latin class, and we were talking about some grammatical thing. And my buddy who was sitting next to me, he turned to me and he said, I never understood grammar until I took Latin. And I thought about it, and, I thought, you're right, because in English class, when they were teaching us grammar in English, it just was hard to think about grammar with reference to a language that I'm really not used to thinking about. When you study a foreign language, you have to kind of think about it as you go. You can't just, launch into it because you have to learn it first. So when you study grammar along with Latin, you end up getting a lot of grammar knowledge that you might not have otherwise had. Let me give you an example of what I mean when I say that we don't think about our native language. Okay, so here's what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that when it comes to your native language, you don't really think about it much. You just speak it because you've been speaking it your whole life. But when you study a foreign language, you think about it. Okay, and here's an example of what I mean. I read this in a book once. the author of the book was saying that in English, the word have, H-A-V-E, have, it gets pronounced differently depending on how we use it in a sentence. If I say, I have a cat, I say have with a V sound in there, right? I say, I have a cat. But if I want to say that I must go to the store, and I say, I have to go to the store, the author of this book pointed out that we don't say it the same way. We substitute an F sound in where the V sound in the word have ought to be. So we don't say, I have to go to the store. We say, I have to go to the store. I have to go. And when I read that, I thought, what's he talking about? And so I started saying it just to test it out. And by golly, he was right. And I've noticed it ever since that time. When I say I have to do something, I say, I have to. Okay? Probably because the word after have there in that context starts with a T. So going from the F to the T is easier. I have to go to the store. But nobody says, I have to go to the store, because you'd have to slow it down and really pronounce it clearly. So I was, 35 or 40 years old, and this book was teaching me something about my language that I had never thought of before, because it's my native language, and I don't think about my native language. So that's an example of what I mean when I say we don't think about our native language. But when you study a foreign language, you have to think it over. And so that can be a good opportunity to learn grammar. So my point here is that, in my view, studying Latin can give you an opportunity to learn grammar in a way that is superior to the opportunity you have to learn grammar in an English class. So the grammar translation method of studying Latin has value not only for learning to read a Latin text and learning the Latin language, but for just learning language awareness in general. And language awareness is a good thing. The more you are aware of language and linguistic issues, the better you will be able to communicate. And I would argue that the better you'll be able to write. A lot of the study of writing is just awareness of things. Being aware of what constructions work, which ones don't work, which ones are clear, which ones aren't, which ones are easily understood by the reader, which ones can be confusing. It's just awareness and practice. And so, again, I argue that, grammar knowledge, the kind of knowledge you gain from the grammar translation study of Latin, can really benefit you in a general kind of way, as far as a general education goes. Because no matter who you are, the ability to communicate clearly is going to be an important thing to have. So let me wrap up this part of the lesson. In this particular lesson, because it's a review lesson, I just wanted to take a few minutes to say some things that have been on my mind as we go through the class, the recorded lectures. And since there's not much learning material here, I wanted to just take this as an opportunity to say some of these things that have been on my mind. So those are some thoughts that you can just put in your back pocket and think about, as they pertain to your own personal study, your goals for what you want to do in the future with Latin, and your study habits. And I just wanted to share with you my own personal philosophy and how this recorded series fits in with that philosophy, so that you can see kind of what I'm after, what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to accomplish with this series. Okay, great. So all that stuff that I wanted to say, that's all out of the way now. So let's jump into section 219 now, and let's move forward into our study of Julius Caesar and his big written work known as Caesar's Gallic Wars. So here in this section, the authors of the book want to give you a little bit of history. They want to tell you about Julius Caesar, who he was, and a little bit about his career and his influence in ancient Rome. What they want to do here is they want to contextualize his work known as Caesar's Gallic Wars so that you can understand how it fits into the history. So who was Julius Caesar? Julius Caesar is probably the most famous Roman in history. You could walk down the street and ask anybody who was Julius Caesar, and they'll probably know something about him. The reason Julius Caesar is so famous, well, there are several reasons, but to me, the main number one reason is that he was there as the ancient Roman government transitioned from one thing to another thing. He was there at a huge point of revolution and transition. So let's talk about that a minute. When you study the ancient Romans, you divide the history of the ancient Romans into two major parts, okay? There are more subparts than this, but it's two large major parts. The first one is called the Republic, and the second one is called the Empire. Somewhere between 50 BC and 30 BC, in those 20 years, we have a transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. During the days of the Roman Republic, you had a government that looked like this. You had two elected officials every year who served as basically the president, okay? And these were called consuls. Every year, you would have two consuls. There was no separation between military and civilian. So these two elected leaders were in charge of the government, but they could also lead armies. And so these consuls would serve for a period of 1 year. In order to get up to that high level of government, you had to go through something called the Cursus Onorum, okay? And Cursus Onorum is a Latin phrase that means course of offices, course of political offices, okay? In Latin, the word honor, H-O-N-O-R, it reminds us of our English word honor, but it doesn't really mean the same thing as in English. In Latin, the word honor means, basically it means political offices. And cursus means course, like a race course. So cursus honorum, honorum is genitive plural, it means a course of political offices. And so what this means, what the cursus honorum was, it was an expected series of government positions that you would have to serve in an expected order. So you'd start out with this lower ranking government position, and then you might move up to be something called an aedile, which was a political office that had to do with looking after the buildings in Rome. And then you'd move up to a higher office called praetor. And the praetors, they had different jobs, but one of their main jobs was running the judicial system. They could also lead armies when needed. And then once you had done that, you were eligible to run for consul. So you couldn't just start out being a consul. You had to work your way up through the ladder, the corporate ladder, so to speak, of Roman political offices. The ancient Romans, during the Republic, they did not like it when one person got too much power. They wanted to prevent one guy from getting too much power, and so they tried to diversify it by having 1-year terms for the consuls so that the power was more spread out among the government officials and not so concentrated in the hands of one person. Now, one problem they had was that they did not really have a written constitution. In the United States, we have a constitution that is written down and is enshrined in a big glass case in Washington, D.C. In the ancient Roman Republic, they had a constitution, but it was not a written one. They had basically tradition and precedent. They had basically the way we've always done it. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the mos maiorum. Mos maiorum means the custom of the ancestors, which means basically tradition, the way we've always done it that's been handed down from the past. So their constitution was not a written document, but a set of expectations, precedents, and practices. Over time, people started to abuse the system. They started to try to push the limits, and they tried to start jumping over certain offices in the Cursus Onorum. They didn't want to go through all the lower offices. They wanted to jump straight to the top. Sometimes they would get an army and try to force something to happen with military might instead of through, elections and government stuff. Sometimes they would assassinate political officials. Sometimes, there was a certain office called the Tribune of the plebs, and the Tribune. This is a whole different topic about social classes in ancient Rome. But to make a long story short, sometimes the tribune would try to use his office in ways that technically were legal, but were not really part of the tradition. And so he would try to push the limits of what he could do, and that would make the Senate mad, and then the Senate would get bent out of shape, but the tribune wanted to push the issue, and so that would create conflict. So my point here is that as you get into the 1st century BC, somewhere around the year 120 or 100 BC, the wheels start to come off of the Roman system, okay? And so right about that time in history is when Julius Caesar is born. He's born into this system where you have some really ambitious people trying to grab power. Another big thing about Roman culture is that if you're a Roman aristocrat, you're supposed to live up to the expectations of your ancestors. Let's say that your great-grandfather reached a certain political office. In your family, there might be an expectation that you do the same thing. So there's a little bit of family pressure to succeed and to live up to your past ancestors. Also, there's just raw ambition. There was a lot of bribery, a lot of people trying to get out there and really make a name for themselves. And so this is what Julius Caesar did early in his career. Julius Caesar was extremely ambitious. He was also very talented and had a natural ability to lead. So as the 1st century wears on, Caesar moves up in the food chain, the corporate ladder, so to speak, called the Cursus Onorum. And eventually he ends up making sort of a power arrangement with 2 other Romans, a very rich Roman named Crassus, and a very popular Roman general named Pompey. That's a Pompey. So Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, they don't necessarily like each other, but they reach a sort of deal that allows the 3 of them to support each other's political goals, because they're all 3 really ambitious and they all want things. So the idea here is you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You support me in what I'm doing, I'll support you, and we all 3 get what we're after. This political arrangement with these 3 guys is called the First Triumvirate, okay? The word triumvirate is comprised of 2 parts. The TRI at the beginning means 3, and the VIR in the middle of the word, wir, that means men. And so tree and wir put it together, and it means 3 men. Later, there's a second triumvirate, which we're not to yet, but this is what we call the First Triumvirate. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus working out a deal where they basically control the government. So instead of the Roman government being in the hands of the Senate and the consuls and the praetors, it's really being run behind the scenes by these 3 guys. Pompey the general, Crassus the rich guy, and Caesar the really ambitious guy. So with these 3 guys forming a triumvirate and pulling the strings of the government behind the scenes, they could basically get whatever they want. They could influence people to do what they wanted, to get their policies passed, and basically to get their way and just be in control. One of my old Latin teachers used to tell me, he used to say, people think that during the Roman Empire, that's when the Romans took over control of all the lands around the Mediterranean. He said, but really, when you look at the history of it, you find that the Romans took control of all those places back while they were still a republic. And after the transition from republic to empire, really all the lands were already there. They were already under Roman control. You know, the Romans did add a little bit, but most of them were already in Roman hands before the empire even came into existence. So the power of the Roman state during the years of the Republic, you know, the power was increasing as they gained control of more and more places. And so one of the places they really wanted to get control of was Gaul. That's the area today known as France. And so these faraway places outside of Italy were called provinces, okay? And so the way it worked was that you would serve for a year as consul, and then after your year of being consul was finished, the Senate would assign you to go and be in charge of a province. And so that office, to my knowledge, is called proconsul. So what does the term proconsul mean? Well, the preposition pro means in place of. And so if you add that to the word consul, you get a word that means something like in the place of a consul. So if you send someone to a faraway province to serve as proconsul, you're giving them the power over that place as if they were consul of it. So you could talk about someone as having proconsular authority or proconsular power. So anyway, it was common for a consul to be given a province after the consul's term as consul was over. And what this could do, it could really enrich the consul, because once they get to that province, they could tax the province and use it for personal gain. They could get rich from it. It wasn't really very moral, but that's what they did. They made money off of their role in charge of a province. Okay, so once the Romans conquered a place, you could have a proconsul in charge there who's getting rich off of the province. Okay, so in 59 BC, they worked it out in such a way where Julius Caesar would be consul, and then after his year of being consul, he would go to Gaul and be governor of Gaul. That is proconsul. Okay, so that's the deal that the First Triumvirate worked out. So keep in mind that at this time in history, the Romans ruled a little bit of Gaul, but not all of it. At the top of Italy, there is a range of mountains called the Alps, okay? And so we have two terms that pertain to Gaul that refer to the Alps, okay? In Latin, we have the preposition cis, that's C-I-S, and cis means on this side of, and then trans, you already know that word, trans means across, or it can also mean on the other side of. So if we take the word Alps and we put cis on the front, we get Kisalpine, okay? Or Kisalpina is a Latin adjective. If something is Kisalpina, it means it's on this side of the Alps. If something is Transalpina, it means it's on the other side of the Alps. So if you turn to the back of the book, you'll see a map there, and you'll see that at the top of Italy, it says Galia Kisalpina. Okay, so we all know that Italy is shaped kind of like a boot, right? So at the very top of the boot, where the top of the boot connects with the rest of Europe, that's what I'm talking about. That's Galia Kisalpina. To an ancient Roman, that means Gaul on this side of the Alps. So that was still considered part of Gaul, but just a part of Gaul that's, you know, closer to them on their same level of altitude. If you cross over the Alps, you know, do a big mountain crossing, you get over into what today is the south of France. And they called that Gallia Transalpina, okay? Gaul on the other side of the Alps. So by Caesar's day, the Romans already controlled that area, this slice of land across the bottom of what would today be France, And eventually they annexed it. And they just said, okay, this is Roman territory now. They made it official. And from that point forward, it was called the province, Provincia. And that name, Provincia, it survives even until today because that area of France is called Provence, from the Latin word Provincia, which means province. So here's what happened. 59 BC, Julius Caesar serves his term as consul. He's part of the First Triumvirate. He makes arrangements to be consul that year, and then he makes arrangements to be given the province of Gaul. So Caesar becomes proconsul of the Roman province in Gaul. Now remember, there's no separation at all between civilian and military office. In the United States, we have a strict separation between military and civilian. But in ancient Rome, they didn't have that. A civilian politician, a civilian, political leader could take an army and just go out and lead the army in battle and could command the army. So when Julius Caesar becomes proconsul of the Roman province in Gaul, he takes on a role that involves all kinds of power. He is in charge of it politically. He's in charge of it militarily. He can command troops. If there are Roman troops stationed there, he can command them. In fact, he's the commander-in-chief of all the Roman troops there. He can even draft new troops. He can lead the troops into battle. And also, in Caesar's Gallic Wars, it tells us that Caesar had some judicial responsibilities too. He had to go to hear cases, apparently. So, to sum up, Julius Caesar, as governor of the Roman province of Gaul, had absolute power. He had power over the military, the judicial system, the civilian government, everything, okay? And so when you put all that power into the hands of a really ambitious guy, ambitious things are going to happen, okay? So what starts to happen is that Julius Caesar looks for any excuse he can find to start expanding Roman influence in Gaul, okay? The first thing that happens is that the Helvetii, that's a tribe that is in the area that today would be Switzerland. According to Caesar's Gallic Wars, according to his writings, the Helvetii concoct a weird plan to move out of their territory in Switzerland and move west to greener pastures, okay? So they ask Julius Caesar, who's the governor of Gaul, the southern, area of Gaul that's the Roman province there. They say, hey, Julius Caesar, can we go on a path that cuts just a little bit through your territory? We'd like to go west, and if you allow us to just cut through your territory a little bit, that'll make the journey a lot easier and simpler for us. So Julius Caesar, basically, to make a long story short, he says no, but then they decide to do it anyway. And so then Caesar starts this basically all-out war on the Helvetii. So he uses this as an excuse to just fight this huge conflict, this big slaughter with the Helvetii. And he shares in his writings that many years before, the Helvetii had defeated the Romans in battle. And so, how dare they do that? How dare they have the audacity to defeat the Romans? And so Caesar is kind of nursing a grudge against the Helvetii for that reason. Remember, in the Roman mind, things that happened to your ancestors, they still matter today. So those past events are still important in the mind of a Roman. So that's one example of Caesar making excuses to fight these big conflicts that expand Roman influence. And not just Roman influence, but his own personal influence. When he fights these battles and wins, he increases his own stature, his own fame, his own reputation, his own wealth. Okay? Another thing that happens is that further north, up almost into like the central part of what would today be France, there was another tribe called the Aedui, that's Aedui. I believe in this book they spell it with an H. They call it the Haidui. And so Rome had a diplomatic relationship with the Haidui. They had, the Roman Senate had bestowed a title on the Haidui. They had called them the friend of the Roman people. So they had a friendly diplomatic relationship with them. So then, later, to make a long story short, the Haidui, they get in trouble with a German warlord. They invite this German warlord to come over and fight their enemies for them. And the German warlord, his name is Ariovistus, he ends up saying, "Hey, you guys have some nice land. I think I'll take over." So they get into trouble with this German chieftain, and they reluctantly ask Caesar for help. And so that starts a huge conflict between Caesar and Ariovistus. So the examples I'm giving you here, these are just a couple of examples of the ways in which Julius Caesar gets into big, huge military conflicts with Gallic tribesmen and other people. And so what that does for Caesar is it allows him to expand his influence, expand his territory, expand his reputation, expand his wealth. And then, to top it all off, he's writing these commentaries and then sending the commentaries back to Rome. And so some historians believe that he would send them back to Rome each year, and somehow they would become public knowledge. So they became, as far as some historians are concerned, we're not sure about this, we don't fully know, but we think that they might have been ways for Julius Caesar to share what a great time he's having in Gaul and show everyone how great and powerful he is, and to basically boast about his accomplishments. I think some historians think that the Commentarii, his commentary on the Gallic Wars, some historians think that they're briefings sent to the Senate, and other historians think that they were more for public consumption. Again, we don't know for sure. But considering Caesar's personality and his political goals, it certainly is not out of the question that they were sent back to Rome to bolster his reputation and set him up for future success. So from about 58 BC to approximately 51 or 50 BC, Julius Caesar is a proconsul in Gaul. He's always expanding the territory. He's fighting battles. He's drafting up new troops. And by the time that, 8-year or 7-year period is over, he has subdued most of Gaul. There's still pockets of resistance, but Caesar really did a lot of heavy lifting there with as far as military conflicts goes. And if you read Caesar's Gallic Wars in English, you can get the scope of what happens year by year and how he works his way to the further reaches of Gaul, up to the northwest corner where the Venetii live, and up to the northeast corner where the Belgae lives. That's where today Belgium is. The general pattern you see is that he fights in the summer, and then in the cold winter they go into kind of a winter quarters, and they just sort of wait out the winter. Although one time they have to fight in the winter when it's really cold. So Caesar is in Gaul for about 7 or 8 years. And then in, I can't remember, 51 or 50 BC, he starts to make preparations to come back to Rome. And so this creates problems. I mentioned to you a while back about the First Triumvirate. The First Triumvirate consists of Pompey, the famous general, Caesar, and Crassus, who was very wealthy. Okay. Julius Caesar had a daughter named Julia, and Julia ended up getting married to Pompey, even though Pompey was much, much older than she was. But apparently they had a good marriage. So basically, even though Pompey was older than Caesar, Caesar was Pompey's father-in-law. And that's part of what bound them together, was this marital union between Julius Caesar's daughter and Pompey. Okay, so they're connected politically and through marriage too. So when Caesar's daughter Julia died, I believe in childbirth, I can't remember, but Caesar's daughter Julia dies, and now they lose that connection. Now that Julia is dead, Pompey and Caesar don't really have that familial connection anymore. So this starts to strain the relationship between Caesar and Pompey. Another thing that puts strain on their relationship is the fact that Crassus dies too. Crassus was, as I said before, extremely wealthy. He owned huge amounts of real estate in Rome. But he had always dreamed of having military success and having military accolades. So somehow he gets himself into a position where he's the head of an army, and he heads to the Near East, to an area, what today would basically be Iran, because he wants to fight a group of people called the Parthians. He thinks that if he can fight the Parthians and be victorious, that he will receive military accolades and military recognition. Unfortunately, he dies and never gets the victory he wants. So now, out of those 3 original members of the Triumvirate, only 2 remain, and their relationship is starting to sour. People in Rome, as Caesar's term in Gaul starts to come to an end, people in Rome are starting to get nervous because Julius Caesar has this large army of hardened, battle-experienced troops. What's he going to do with all that? And so what Caesar wants is he wants to come back to Rome and be consul again. And so now in the Roman Senate, there's a sort of a polarization. Okay, you have Caesar's friends in the Senate, and you have Caesar's enemies in the Senate. His enemies have joined forces with Pompey. So you have the Pompeian party, and you have the Caesarian party. Okay, those are the 2 big parties fighting in the Senate to figure out what's going to happen next. And so everyone starts to get mad at each other. We start to get Mark Antony, the same Mark Antony who later has a relationship with Cleopatra in Egypt. Mark Antony is tribune of the plebs. And so he's trying to get Caesar's way in the Senate. He's trying to convince the Senate to give Caesar what he wants. But then the people supporting Pompey in the Senate, they don't want to do that. So there's a big conflict in the Senate. They want Caesar to lay down his military command. They want him to disband his army. But Caesar doesn't really want to do that. In fact, they work out a scheme to where they actually get one of Caesar's legions reassigned to Pompey. They ask Caesar to give up one of his legions for one reason, but then once they have that legion, they switch it to Pompey. So they are doing some trickery there. Finally, everything comes to a head. Mark Antony leaves Rome. He rides north to meet Caesar at his camp. And at that point, civil war breaks out. Caesar rides south with his troops. That's when you get the famous incident where he crosses the Rubicon, because really a commander was not allowed to bring an army into Roman territory. That was against the law. So when he crosses the Rubicon with his troops, he enters into an illegal act, and that's why we have the expression, when you cross the Rubicon, you're sort of like committing to a course of action. It's like a point of no return. Once you do that, there's really no going back. You can't undo it. Like sometimes you hear people say that you can't unring a bell. You know, once you ring the bell, it's wrong. You can't unring it. That's kind of what happens when you cross the Rubicon. You do something that you can't really undo or come back from. So Caesar brings his troops, this very well-trained army from Gaul. And so Caesar and Pompey get into this huge civil war, and they end up fighting each other in a very bloody conflict. Finally, after several years of war, Caesar is victorious. Pompey dies. He dies in Egypt. Caesar takes control of the government, and Caesar is basically made dictator. At this point, all the old trappings of the Roman government in the Roman Republic have started to fall apart. And instead of having consuls every year, you just get Caesar as sort of this perpetual dictator. And so effectively at this point, that's the end of the Roman Republic. The way things had been for hundreds of years now comes to an end, and there's really no way to put it back together again. It's just, at this point, who has the biggest army. A few years later, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar is assassinated, and then there's more civil war. Finally, Octavian, who is adopted by Caesar, he takes up Caesar's cause and gains loyalty from Caesar's troops, and he fights some more bloody civil wars, and then eventually he becomes the first emperor, and now the Rome enters into the second large division of history, in which it becomes the Roman Empire. And Octavian is the first emperor of the Roman Empire. So that's just a quick overview of the history of what happens during this period of ancient Rome, okay? So the literary work known as Caesar's Gallic Wars is the written commentary, the written records that Julius Caesar himself wrote about his time in Gaul when he was fighting the Gallic tribesmen and when he was governor of the Roman province of Gaul. And in Caesar's Gallic Wars, you have huge amounts of military conflict. And so a lot of what you read about is just war with the Gauls. In fact, that's in the title. You know, it's about Caesar's Gallic Wars, not about Caesar's Gallic peace, okay? It's not called Caesar's, happy time as governor of Gaul. No, it's called Caesar's Gallic Wars because he's fighting wars all the time. So it is, primarily a military work. It's all about Caesar and his armies fighting all these different Gallic tribes. And so that work, that literary work, that is the literary work that this textbook is based on. Okay, it's in the 50s BC when Caesar is governor of Gaul fighting the Gallic tribesmen. So that's the historical context of the literary work known as Caesar's Gallic Wars. And so, as we move on to the next section, which is section 220, that's what we're going to start to read. We're going to start at the very beginning of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and we're going to read the first few lines of the work. So in this lesson, you'll read your first real Latin from a real Latin text written by an ancient Roman. So it's a pretty exciting moment for you in your Latin studies. Okay, let's move on now to section 220, in which we will begin to read Caesar's Gallic Wars. We'll read the very beginning of the work, the first few lines. And before we get going too far into this, I want to recommend a really good book to you. This book is an edition of Caesar's Gallic Wars by a Latin scholar named Hans Friedrich Müller. It's a really good book. It's got the text, it's got notes, it's got vocabulary, and so you can find it online at your favorite online bookseller. Again, the last name is Müller, and it's black and has a bust of Julius Caesar on the front. It's called Caesar, Selections from his Commentarii de Bello Gallico. You can get it just for a few bucks, and that will really help you as you go through the text. Okay, so let's dive in and start reading the text. Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres. Okay, the subject is Gallia, that means Gaul. The verb is, which in Latin is est. And then the word divisa means divided. So Gallia est and divisa says Gaul is divided. The third declension adjective omnis is here modifying Gallia. So that means the entirety of Gaul, the whole of Gaul, or perhaps all Gaul, okay? So in English, we can say Gallia omnis, is all Gaul. Okay, so what we have so far would say all Gaul is divided. In partes tres, that means into 3 parts. Okay, partes is a form of the noun pars. That's a third declension noun that means part. In addition to part, it can also mean side or direction. It can mean several things. And if you read Caesar's Gallic Wars long enough, you'll see it in all those contexts. Of course, tres means 3. Notice that in here is taking the accusative case. When that happens, when in takes the accusative, it usually means things like into. It can also mean against. But here it means into. So we can say into 3 parts. The idiom here of saying into 3 parts seems similar in Latin and in English. So the first phrase here says, all Gaul is divided into 3 parts. Now, Caesar is going to tell us about the 3 parts. He's going to tell us a little bit about each one. So over the next couple of lines, that's what we'll be hearing from him about, is these 3 parts, ending with the word appellantur. And the whole thing starts with a relative pronoun, and that's the word quorum. Quorum is genitive plural and feminine. Now, we've been over this a million times. We know that a relative pronoun connects with its antecedent in certain ways, okay? It gets its number and gender from its antecedent, but it gets its case from the role it plays in the relative clause. Okay, so quorum, being a relative pronoun, it's going to get its case and number from its antecedent. What is its antecedent? Partes. So quorum, being genitive plural, we can translate it as something like of which. So all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, of which, that's what we have so far. And in this first little part of the next phrase here, quorum unam incolunt Belgae, let's just take that much of it. In that little section, the subject is Belgae and the verb is incolunt. Okay, Belgae means the Belgic peoples, or perhaps Belgians. This noun is grammatically feminine. Notice that Belgae has the first declension feminine ending. That does not mean that the entire tribe was comprised of women. All it means is that the word Belgae is feminine as far as Latin grammar. It's grammatically feminine. So that's nominative plural. And then we have the verb incolunt. That means inhabit. Okay, that's a form of the verb incolo, and it's third person plural, present tense. So Belgae and incolunt together say the Belgians inhabit. What do they inhabit? They inhabit unam. Unam means one, and it's accusative singular. So the Belgians inhabit one what? Well, there's a footnote here. Notice that footnote 1 is there next to the word unam. So let's read footnote 1. Footnote 1 says, unam, aliyam, and tertiam agree with partem, which is implied. In the past, we've talked a little bit about understood words. An understood word is a word that is implied by the text, but is not actually present in the text. And when you translate from Latin into English, and there's an understood word there, it helps to put it into your translation. You don't have to, but sometimes it's helpful. So footnote number 1 is telling us that the word partem is understood along with unam. So what we have so far says all Gaul is divided into 3 parts, of which the Belgians inhabit 1. So if we throw in the word partem, which means part, along with unam, we can say of which the Belgians inhabit 1 part. in your English translation, you don't have to put in the word part there, but you can if you want to, especially if you're just a student reading your first piece of real Latin literature. And we do the same thing in English all the time. For example, if I say to you, I have 3 cats. One is black, one is brown, and one is orange. I don't have to put in the word cat every time. I don't have to say this. I have 3 cats. One cat is black, one cat is brown, and one cat is orange. I don't have to put in the word cat every time. If I simply say one is black, one is brown, one is orange, that suffices. You know what I mean because only a moment ago I mentioned cats. So based on the context, I don't have to put in the word cat every time. It's understood. So we do this exact same thing in English. So if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can get a pencil or a pen, and in tiny letters, you could write over the word unam, you could write the word partem as a study aid. Okay, so what we have so far says this. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts, of which the Belgians inhabit 1, as in 1 part. Okay, let's take the next 2 words, that's Aliyam and Aquitani. Again, with the word Aliyam, we're going to have the word partem as an understood word. So you could write partem above Aliyam. Who are the Aquitani? They are the Gallic tribesmen in the area of Gaul, which today is called Aquitaine. In fact, that's where the name comes from, in the southwest corner of France. And so, not only is the word partem here understood with Aliyam, also the verb incolent is understood. The Aquitani word, that's still working with the verb incolent. Okay, the Aquitani are inhabiting something. And what are they inhabiting? They're inhabiting Aliyam, which means another. So literally what we have says the Aquitani, another. But what it really means is the Aquitani inhabit another in the sense of another part. Okay, so partem is understood, incolent is understood. Let's take the next 2 words, tertiam and qui. Okay, the word tertiam is a first and second declension adjective. It means third. Tertius, tertia, tertium. Again, it's accusative singular feminine because it agrees with the word partem, which is understood yet again. So again, if you want to, as a study aid, you could write the word partem above tertium. Again, the verb incolent is still in effect here. It's understood. And the subject here is qui. Qui means who. So here's how this is going to read. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts, of which the Belgians inhabit 1, the Aquitani inhabit another, and we'll throw in the word and here. We'll say, and those who, that's qui, who, they inhabit tertiam, the third. So qui is the subject of the sentence, working along with the verb incolent, inhabiting tertiam. Tertiam is the direct object here. So you may be asking the question, what is qui doing here? Okay, qui is a relative pronoun. Within the relative clause here, it's the subject of the verb appellantur. Okay, so qui works with appellantur. The verb appellantur is a form of the verb appello, which means to call or name. So appellantur is passive, it's third person plural, present tense. So it means they are being called or they are being named, or more simply, they are called or they are named. So qui and appellantur together say, who are named. So when you see a relative pronoun like qui, the question comes to mind, what is its antecedent? Every example we've studied so far in the exercises, every example of a relative clause or relative pronoun has an antecedent. The thing here is that qui doesn't really have an antecedent. More on that later. But just keep in mind that it's not really referring back to anything. Now direct your attention to the word Celti. That means Celts. It's a nominative plural. Again, it's grammatically feminine. So Qui, Appelantur, and Celti together say, who are called Celts. Also, they're called Gauls. Notice the word Galli is nominative plural, except that one is masculine as far as its grammatical gender. And that's going to work with Appelantur as well. Qui Appelantur Galli, who are called Gauls. Okay? So we have a group of people here who are called Celts, and they're called Gauls. Take a look now at the words Ibsorum and Lingua. Okay, lingua is a first declension noun that means language or tongue. And notice that it's ablative singular. It's got a macron over the A. According to Mueller's book, this is an ablative of means. So we'll translate it as in the language. Lingua is being possessed by Ibsorum. Okay, let's take a quick look at footnote number 2. It's going to tell us about Ibsorum. Okay, this passage of Caesar's Gallic Wars, it includes a couple of grammatical elements that you have not yet studied. One of those is this pronoun here called ipse. Okay, I-P-S-E, ipse. That is what we call in Latin an intensive pronoun. We do the same thing in English. We have words like myself, yourself, itself, herself, himself, ourselves. That's how we translate ipse. So let's say I have the pronoun ego, I, and I put ipse with it. Ipse is a masculine nominative singular. So if I say ego ipse, that means I myself. So the pronoun ipse is an intensive pronoun in the sense that it strengthens or intensifies the meaning or the pointing out of a noun or pronoun, okay? Tu in Latin means you. If I say tu ipse, that's like you yourself. If I say Caesar ipse, that's like saying Caesar himself. So that's what ipse does. We'll study it a few lessons from now. That's just a quick introduction to it. Ibsorum, as you can tell from the ending, is genitive plural. So it's going to mean of they themselves. So Ibsorum and Lingua, together, those two words say in the language of they themselves. In other words, in their own language is what he means. So the Celts don't speak the same language as the Romans. The Celts are Celts. They speak Celtic languages. The Romans are Romans. They speak Latin. Okay, so Qui Appelantur, Lingua, Celti, and Ibsorum, those words are going to say this. Who are called, in the language of they themselves, Celti. Okay, so in the language of they themselves, they're called Celts. They call themselves Celts. By the way, who are the Celts anyway? Why do the Celts live in what is today France? Those of you who are history buffs, you know that during the first millennium, the first 1,000 years of our current era, we have lots of Germanic tribes moving from the eastern part of Europe to the west. Also, we have lots of Scandinavian people moving from east to west, okay, into what is today France. We have Germanic tribes like the Franks, the Frankish peoples. Also, we have Goths, Gothic tribes. Up north, you have the Vikings, who are Scandinavians from Norway, places like that. So the Scandinavians, the Vikings, they head west into the northern parts of England. They also head to the northern part of France, and that's why the northern part of France is called Normandy, because Norman means Northmen, which is just Vikings, right? And then you have Germanic tribes like the Angles and the Utes. and the Saxons, they go and they start to invade Britain. The Utes are from really from Denmark, the Jutland Peninsula that sticks out from the northern part of Europe. And then on the continent itself, you have Frankish tribes moving west into what is today France. In fact, that's where the word France comes from. It's from the Frankish tribes, the Franks. So you have these big movements of people going west. But before they did that, those areas were inhabited by Celts, Celtic peoples. Okay, so Celts inhabited Gaul. They inhabited Britain, Scotland, Ireland. All those places were inhabited by Celtic peoples. And so as the Germanic tribes and Vikings, as they moved west, they ended up pushing the Celtic peoples further and further west. And so if you look at a map today of where the Celts live today, the Celts still survive, ethnically speaking, you'll see that the Celts were pushed into the westernmost regions of these places. For example, in the northwest corner of France, there's an area called Brittany, which has a strong Celtic flavor to its ethnicity. Also in England, you'll notice that Celts got pushed west into the westernmost parts of that island. In the southwest, you have an area called Cornwall, and those folks are what we call the Cornish, and they speak the Cornish language, which is an ancient Celtic language. In the large central part of England, the Celts got pushed west into what is now Wales. And so people who speak Welsh, well, that's a Celtic language. Also, there are remnants of Celtic languages in Scotland. We have Gaelic, which is a Celtic language. And then we have in Ireland, the Irish language is also a Celtic language. Okay, so England, the name England comes from the Germanic tribe known as the Angles, Angles. When the Angles came into Great Britain, it became the land of the Angles, or Angle land. And that's where the word England comes from. It's Angle land, you see, the land of the Angles. And so those of you who are interested in legends about King Arthur, the whole story behind King Arthur is that he was one of those original Celtic inhabitants of Britain fighting against the Germanic, Anglo-Saxon invaders. And so his heroic efforts were fighting off the Anglo-Saxons. Sometimes you see him represented as a Romanized Briton. So back to our text, we're at a period in history now when the Celts still lived in France. This is before they were pushed west by invading Germanic tribes, by Goths, Saxons, Vikings, all those folks. So that's why the Celts are here, and that's why Julius Caesar is saying that in their own language they're called Celts, because they live in that area. Okay, so let's back up a bit. We have qui starting a relative clause. It says, who are called, that's appellantur, who are called lingua Ibsorum, in the language of they themselves, Celti. Okay, so they are called in the language of they themselves, Celti. Now we have nostra and Galli, okay? Nostra is an adjective that means our, O-U-R. We've talked about understood words. Here, along with nostra, the word lingua is understood. So if you want to, you can write the word lingua above nostra. Make sure you put a macron over the A, because it's ablative singular. And so what that means there, nostra, it means in the sense of in our language. So when you translate nostra, translate it as in our language, noting that the word language is understood. And what are they called in our language? Galli. Okay, so what is Caesar saying here? He's saying that they're referred to by two different names, the inhabitants of Gaul. In their own language, they call themselves the Celts. But in Latin, the Romans refer to them as Gauls. So the whole relative clause says this: who are called, in the language of they themselves, Celts. In our language, Gauls. So we've unpacked most of this. We still have the problem, though, of qui. We never found the antecedent for qui. So how do we connect it to the rest of the sentence? Basically, what we have to do is throw in our own antecedent into our English translation. So instead of translating qui as who, it makes our translation smoother if we translate it as those who. So think of qui here in this situation as meaning those who, and so here's what we get. Those who are called, in the language of they themselves, Celts, in our language, Galli, those people, that group, they inhabit the Tertiam, in the sense of the Tertiam partem, the third part. Okay, so that whole relative clause there, the whole point of it is to tell you about that group of people who inhabit the third part of Gaul. So let's put the whole thing together and see what we can come up with, okay? All Gaul is divided into three parts, of which the Belgians inhabit one part, the Aquitani inhabit another part, and those who are called, in the language of they themselves, Celts, in our language, Gauls, inhabit the third part. Okay? It's a little clunky, but that's how it all fits together. So if you look around at other translations, besides the one I just gave you, you may see that some of the words are moved around. The order is different. They might not include understood words. That's fine. Different people will translate it different ways. But the way I just gave it to you just now, that establishes the meaning and the content of what the Latin is saying. So, but you may see it translated slightly differently elsewhere. Okay, let's move on now to the next sentence. And here's the next sentence in Latin. Hi omnes lingua institutis legibus interse differunt. Okay, as I mentioned a moment ago, some of the grammatical ingredients that you find in this piece of Caesar's Gallic Wars are things that you have not yet studied. For example, we saw ipse, which is the intensive pronoun in Latin. And now in this sentence, we're seeing another thing that you have not yet studied, and that's the demonstrative, which is hic. Now, we've already talked about demonstratives. We talked about is ea id, which we learned is a demonstrative pronoun, or it can be a demonstrative adjective. That's how demonstratives work in Latin, is they can be pronouns or adjectives, depending on if they have some other noun accompanying them. And so here we have hic, and that's spelled H-I-C. You can see that in footnote 3, which is right next to the word he. That's the first word of the sentence. And so hic basically means this, okay? In Latin, if you want to say this, you say hic. If you want to say that, you say ille. That's I-L-L-E, ille. Okay, so hic and ille, those two words mean this and that. We have not studied them yet. We've studied is ea id, but we have not studied hic and ille, okay? So here, we're jumping ahead of ourselves a bit, and we have a demonstrative that we have not yet studied. Okay, so he is the nominative plural form of hic. Okay, so hic is like is ea id in the sense that it can be a demonstrative adjective or a demonstrative pronoun. So by itself, the word hic just means this. let's say I put it along with the word miles, and I say hic miles. That means this soldier. In that example, hic is a demonstrative adjective. It's describing the word soldier, miles. Now let's say that I just put hic by itself, and I say hic. Well, now it's functioning as a demonstrative pronoun. It means this in the sense of a substantive. It's talking about something. We know a pronoun takes the place of a noun. So in Latin, conceivably, I could say hic est bonus. This is good. Okay, so there, hic is functioning as a pronoun. If I say hic miles est bonus, this soldier is good, now hic is functioning as a demonstrative adjective. And a lot of times in Latin, when you see hic used by itself, it just means this guy. It refers to a person. Okay, so here in this sentence we have he, it's nominative plural, it's a form of hic, so it means these. And along with the word omnes, which means all, he and omnes together will say all these. And who are the all these being referred to? All the tribes that are mentioned in the previous sentence, the Belgae, the Aquitani. So he is the subject of the sentence, and the verb here is differunt. Okay, differunt can mean several things. Here it means to differ, to be different from one another, okay? So the subject and verb here says, he differunt. These differ. Now we're going to have a few ablatives that tell us how they differ. First of all, we have lingua. Notice the macron over the final A there. That's ablative singular. That particular use of the ablative is an ablative of respect. The way we translate it is with respect to language. Okay, so ablative of respect. And so what that gives us here is he differunt lingua. These differ with respect to language. Or more simply, we could just say in language. Now we have institutis, that's ablative plural. And in fact, that's one of our new vocabulary words from last lesson. We learned institutum means custom, right? So here it's ablative plural, and it's ablative of respect. So he differunt, these differ, institutis, with respect to customs. So these differ with respect to language, these differ with respect to customs. Or we could simply say in language, in customs. Now we have legibus. That's a form of the third declension noun lex, L-E-X, which means law. Here it's ablative plural. Again, it's an ablative of respect. So he differunt legibus. These differ with respect to laws. Okay, so just to help you understand the structure of the sentence, let's put it together again. He differunt lingua. These differ with respect to language. He differunt institutis. These differ with respect to customs. He differunt legibus. These differ with respect to laws. So that's the basic structure of the sentence. Now we have interse. Inter is a preposition that takes the accusative case, and it means between. If you have more than two people that it's talking about, you could translate it as among. So interse, se is a reflexive pronoun that means themselves. So interse means something like among themselves. So let's put the whole sentence together, and it says something like this. All these differ among themselves with respect to language, with respect to customs, with respect to laws. If you wanted to, you could say regard instead of respect. You could say with regard to language, with regard to customs, with regard to laws, or you could simply say in language, in customs, in laws. It doesn't really matter. In English, all those things mean roughly the same thing. Okay, let's look at the last sentence here. Gallos ab Aquitanis garumna flumen a Belgis matrona et sequana dividit. So here we have a two-part sentence with a couple of understood words, and we have some geographical names here of rivers. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at the word flumen, which is the subject of the sentence. Okay, flumen is a third declension noun that means river. It's neuter, so if it were nominative plural, it would be flumina. So flumen is the subject, and then dividit is the verb. That means divides. Okay, so the basic structure of the sentence is that the flumen dividit, the river divides, and everything else is kind of built around that. Gallos here is the direct object of dividit. Okay, so the river divides the Gauls. Now we have a prepositional phrase, ab Aquitanis. That means from the Aquitanians, okay, from the people who live in the area known as Aquitania. Okay, so what's it saying here? It's saying the river divides the Gauls from the Aquitani. Okay, so Aquitaine is kind of in the southwest corner of France. So if you look at it, you'll see there's a river between that and the rest of France. That's what he's saying here. He's saying the people who live in that section of Gaul, the Aquitani, they're split off from everyone else by a river. And the name of the river in Latin is Garumna. Okay, so Garumna and flumen go together. So we have to translate the word Garumna into some kind of modern name. And so the name today of that river is the Garonne River. Okay, my French pronunciation is not so good. In French, it might sound something like Garonne, Garonne. Okay, so what we have so far says this: the Garonne River divides the Gauls from the Aquitani. Now, in the second part of the sentence, we have two additional rivers working with the verb dividit. Okay? And we have a couple of understood words here. First of all, flumen is understood, along with matrona and sequana. Those are both rivers. Matrona, that river is the Marne, a river in France, and sequana, that's the Seine River that runs right through the middle of Paris. So they're telling us about some actual rivers. They're telling us how they divide up these different sections of Gaul, okay? So with matrona, think of the word flumen as understood, and with sequana, think about the same thing. The word flumen is understood. So the Marne River, that's how we'll translate matrona, and the Seine River, that's how we'll translate sequana. Okay, so in this section of the sentence, we have the Marne River dividit, the Marne River divides, and the sequana, the Seine River, divides. Well, what do they divide? The way it works is that we have to reuse the direct object Gallos, okay? The Marne and the Seine also are dividing the Gauls. Okay, so Gallos here is understood, flumen is understood. You have to just sort of supply those words for yourself. You have to just keep those words in mind. So Caesar's point here is that the Marne and the Seine divide the Gauls a Belgis, from the Belgians. If you are familiar with the layout of Europe, you know that Belgium is to the northeast, sort of up in the northeastern corner of France. Aquitaine is down in the lower southwest corner. So he's saying that the lower left part, southwest part, Aquitaine, is divided off by the Garonne River. The Belgians up in the northeast are divided off from the rest of Gaul by the Marne and the Seine. So he's describing the geographical borders of the three parts of Gaul that he just mentioned. So he told us there were three parts. Now he's telling us the rivers that divide them into three parts. One last thing, between these two parts of the sentence, right before a Belgis, we can throw in the word and into our English translation. We can say this: the Garonne River divides the Gauls from the Aquitanians, or the Aquitani. And the Marne River and the Seine River divide the Gauls from the Belgians. Again, I had to reuse the word Gallos. I had to treat flumen as understood. I threw in the word and. One last point here. In English, we might look at this as being weird. The fact that Matrona and Sequana, those are both the subject of dividit. So in English, if we have two rivers doing something, we would expect a plural verb. We might say, the Matrona et Sequana dividunt, right? We might want a plural verb. Well, in Latin, you don't have to have that. You can have a singular verb working with two subjects. Okay, so dividit covers the activity being done by the Garumna River. It covers the activity being done by the Matrona, and it covers the activity being performed by the Sequana. It handles all three of those nouns, showing the activity that they are doing. Sometimes in Latin, if you have a two-part subject, you'll see it take a plural verb. Other times you'll see it take a singular verb. It can just really do either one. Okay, that was a lot to talk about. And if you've made it this far, you are to be congratulated. You just read your first real, undiluted Latin. So congratulations. Thanks for listening. This wraps up Lesson 26. We'll see you next time in Lesson 27.